Okay, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. My name is Alicia Thomas. I'm the Executive Director of the Virginia Quilt Museum, and I am joined tonight by Dr. Sarah Over from Virginia Tech. We are so excited to have her. We are here. Oops, I pressed the wrong button. We are here tonight for a webinar about our project for the 250th of the American Revolution that's coming up in a few years, Stitching Together History. Just a brief overview of the timeline of this project. Right now, we are working on hosting webinars like this that help inspire folks from around Virginia and the country to create quilts to submit to the project. You have until September 30th of this year to create a quilt and submit it. The call for entries is open now. It's on callforentry.org. You can find a link right on our website at vaquiltmuseum.org. You can also on our YouTube channel find all of the previous webinars for this and a couple of recordings that I have done. One walks you through the call for entries and how to apply, and another that I just posted today walks you through how to use the Encyclopedia Virginia, which is a project of Virginia Humanities, to also find a topic. So I recommend you look at our YouTube channel and watch all of those videos. They will answer some more of your questions, hopefully. For tonight, we are going to hand it over to Dr. Over in just a moment. There is a chat and a Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen, wherever Zoom is putting it for you. Feel free to put questions in the Q&A. We do have some time at the end for you to ask questions. And for now, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Happy to be here and talking about this fun topic. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen and slides, and I think we're all set. So I am Dr. Sarah Over. I am what is called the Patent and Trademark Resource Center representative. This is somewhere in Virginia that we have this designated support center by the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And that means that we are here to support inventors, entrepreneurs, and like tonight, sometimes historians, people that want to look into what's going on. And the goal of this is to help connect all of you with resources and get started with searching, and especially give you ideas for all your wonderful quilts and any other things that you might want to know about patents and Virginia's history. And so just to talk a little bit about why I'm talking about patents and an overview of history. So in general, you can have someone says, oh, so-and-so invented this, but unless it's down on paper somewhere, it's hard to tell who actually did it, who started this innovations, and all these things that happen. And so that's why I'm focusing on patents that exist that we can look up. You can find them at home. You can find them at your local library. On the World Wide Web is a wonderful thing these days. So just to give you a little bit of snapshot on patents history, because this will inform how we look at patents and inventions that are written down in history through this system. So patents were first started in the US in 1790. And yes, I get to bring in one of our founding fathers because Thomas Jefferson did help to draft patent laws. And so helped with that first system going. In 1836, they introduced patent numbering and examination. So before then, there might be duplicate patents, and a lot of people would submit a model or something else to the patent office, but there was a fire in 1836 that destroyed much of the office, unfortunately. So some of those are lost. And so all of this, everything before around 1836, there might be some gaps in the information. But after that, you can find a lot of things fairly well, including 1842, they introduced design patents. And trademarks were in 1870. So that covers how things look, which are also considered inventions. And then the last century, we had plant patents, and then there was a Modern Patents Act in 1952 that pretty much everything like this. So depending on what you're looking for and what era, what you'll find will look different, and you have to look in different places. But for right now, if you're looking for modern patents, the system requires novel, useful, and non-obvious. And this last one just means that someone who has some knowledge of the area wouldn't already think of it. So it's not, so that gets sort of back towards the novelty. And there's the main patent types. There's utility, which is how things work or how they're composed, put together. You have design. This is what I was talking about with how it looks. You might be familiar with the Little Tikes car or Furby or some classic design patents. And then there's plant patents. They're pretty specific. They have to be asexually propagated and in a cultivated area, but you can think about like fruit trees and strawberries, those kinds of things. One of the earlier design patents was Coca-Cola's bottle, for instance, and I'm bringing up Coca-Cola because they actually had a bottling plant in Virginia for almost a full 100 years. And so that is part of Virginia's history of innovation and business and commercialization as well. So let's jump into some of the earliest inventions. And I already mentioned Thomas Jefferson, who was also known to have lots of inventions, and the swivel chair, a chair that can rotate like the chair I'm in right now, was thought to be one of his inventions. Although since there wasn't a patent system, it's hard to verify this. So it wasn't a patent. And also keep in mind with the Civil War, we still had Virginia all in one state, and West Virginia, you can have inventions from this area that actually physically were the inventors were located in what is now West Virginia. And the other hard part is that there's dates and names only is what I meant to say on that slide, although you did have models. So when you're looking into really old inventions, and I'm going to start talking about some next, there's not as much information to document them, and there's a lot more in the classic historical records. But what I'm getting at with all of this information is that if you can find a patent, you can find someone's name, you can find where they lived, and all this information. So if you're looking to find someone in your own history that might have a patent, if you know where someone up your genealogical tree, maybe a great something, where they lived, what county they were in, sometimes you can find the patent because of that information. So these first patents, as you might expect, were mainly focused on agriculture. This is a big area in Virginia's history, and it still is today. One thing I did find from looking through a list by Burke, who was a commissioner in the patents office. This is a great source for very old patents because you can pretty much just look through the list and say, oh, there's Virginia. And it's even in a OCR data scanned format. And so that's optical character recognition. And so you can even search for VA in it, and that'll help find them. So Virginia had the only tobacco patents through the 1830s, and these were mostly on tobacco curing. The first one was John Robinson of Charlotte, and this is Charlotte in Virginia. And that was February of 1809. Some of the other top patents that were there included hulling and seed/grain. There was over 13 of those. There was a ton of plows as well, and this includes like attachments for plows. So you can think about those early agriculture, they're trying to get their fields done and all these things. And then the most I found was for thrashing machines, over 33 related to that technology. And this is, you think about like if you have a grain and you smash it on a table or something like that, like from out in a field, how that could loosen the grains, those kinds of machines. And again, these could have duplicate patents, but they didn't need to be novel. And there was also metal products around this time, although I didn't look all the way through Burke's list of over 700 pages of patents. So there was even another one in the metal products for tobacco, and that was for tobacco casks. And like the bands that go around it, that was an invention from Richmond in 1840. So there's a lot to be found in these old ones if you're trying to look for ideas and say, okay, I want to learn more about all the inventions of getting agriculture up and running in Virginia. So getting into later in the 1830s, and those first numbered patents, there were still many for agriculture, but lots for things like railroads too. And this was a big part of our history because you have all this agricultural products, you need to be able to send them places. And the first numbered Virginia patent that I could find was 1836, so the first year, and it was a corn sheller machine, so out of Staunton, VA. So it's that was the earliest one I could find. We weren't number one, but we were in the first 50. We had plenty in the first 100 plus. There was even a railway turnout. So this helps the trains turn and things like that. And of course for this talk, I have to include ones that are related to thread and things like that. So the rope yarn putting up, so it was a way of managing rope yarn, and that was from Lynchburg. And a really fun one that's quirky, but you had to do this kind of thing, is that they had a railway cattle stop. So how do you prevent cattle from crossing railroads? So you're sending all this stuff and you have all this cattle wandering around. You don't want them to get hit by the train because it'll cause a problem for the train, and the farmer loses a heifer or a cow, however you want to put it. So there was a lot of these kind of classic agriculture railway kind of ones in the first ones. And here's some pictures that I found as well. So these are patent drawings, and the way patents work is a lot of them are you end up submitting a drawing with the patent to show what it is, because the whole point of the patent system is that someone discloses their invention and they get protection for doing so. And so these are all public domain and available for anyone to look at. The one on the left-hand side is that railway turnout that I was talking about, where you need to figure out how to make the trains be able to turn effectively going off the main line. And the one on the right is the railroad gate. So you can imagine parts of that maybe popping up on the right and left of that to help prevent cattle from crossing in places where there's a break in the fence. And so these are some of the really early patents that were around, and it really gives you a feel for what people cared about those days and what they wanted to keep innovating on. Okay, so let's talk about more in that era, getting closer to the Civil War, but not quite there yet. So the 1850s. One of the things I found that was interesting was there was already a burglar alarm back in 1855. And I was surprised to see this because we think about burglar alarms being electric and being very modern things, but there was already people working on that back in the 1800s even. And you can see why that might be needed when you had very quiet towns, maybe just starting to build up and more people coming in, but still some pockets of lawlessness and things like that. Other one I found was of an earlier lamp that was from Woodstock, Virginia. The burglar alarm actually is from Morgantown, and so it's probably actually in West Virginia today. And this last one on this slide on the far right is actually a very complicated rat trap. So again, you can think about the things that people cared about. They wanted to improve their homes. They want to do lighting. They want to keep the pests out. These are all things that you can think about that people would even care about today still. So that was the 1850s with some of those inventions. Okay, so getting into past the Civil War and the late 1800s, you might already notice that some of these drawings are getting more intricate. So we start having that beginning going towards industry and other things like that, where we have some more complicated mechanical systems. The first one is a kind of repeating cannon. So you can think about like someone turns the crank and bullets come out or whatever comes out. I know that Virginia and West Virginia, guns are important. And so there are inventions out there for those. And this was improvements on it, is what a lot of times the patents are called, because someone has already invented it and then they say, okay, I'm going to make this better and more usable. Maybe I'm improving the internal mechanisms in this case, or maybe I'm improving just the crank. So that's what people do with these patents. So just keep that in mind when you're looking through inventions, is that sometimes they're just an improvement on an earlier one. So it can be hard sometimes to track back and say, okay, what was the original invention? Who was the first to do it? So just keep that in mind. I also found a very complex looking sewing machine. And so this was also, I know that there was a lot of litigation and people arguing about sewing machines, who invented it and things like that. But this was one of the ones that came out in the late 1800s that has this like curving structure, but you can see where the needle is going down in. That is right in here. And then they also include other views of it. And these images are all from the drawings pages in patents, and sometimes you'll have witnesses there and the inventor's name. And so this is certifying that invention. So there's a lot you can get out of just one page from patents sometimes. And the last one, I had to grab another part of Virginia's history, is a peanut harvester. And so this complicated mechanism with all these different letters and numbers on it that are described later in the patent is for harvesting peanuts effectively. And so that's something to keep in mind too, is that all these will be labeled, because people have to say, okay, this part does this part does that, and things like that. So it just depends on which part of the patent you're looking at. And the peanut harvester was out of Newville, Virginia, the repeating cannon, Wythe County, and then Steele's Tavern for the sewing machine. So you can find ones from all over, and I was trying to grab not just from Richmond or Nova, trying to get all over the state. Some of the other early inventions that you can find past the Civil War are the design patents that I mentioned before. Some of these are really interesting because this sunflower kind of shape here is actually the head of a screw, and they say for picture screws. So you can think about things that hold up pictures or other things. It's an ornamental design. And so this kind of drawing here, it ends up as a design patent now, but you can picture someone's brand or something like that today being this kind of image. And so that might be a trademark today. This is especially true of it says the Peach brand, manufactured solely by probably Thomas and Samuel Hargrove at the Union Factory in Richmond, VA. So you can think about the brands that would be on food and other things, these pictures that we think about on like the side of cans and things like that. They originally were a type of patent. Well, today they'd be protected by trademarks, but this is also a great insight into the time, because you can find all these different companies and their brands, and you can look up, okay, what were they selling? Because I hope that this was this one that they were actually selling peaches, for example. And so people try to really grab at people, but this was 1859 for that image with the peaches. That looks pretty good for 1859. So I'm guessing people were interested in buying it. And that screw head is from 1880, and that's out of Norfolk, Virginia, actually. And you can picture how much work that would take to produce back then. Today, we might ask a 3D printer to do that for us. Okay, so onwards to the 20th century with patents. And these, I said towards the start of this, just as a refresher, there weren't always plant patents. And in the 1930s, that's when they started. The earliest one I could find from Virginia was a type of evergreen plant. That's what's on the right middle of the slide. And then, of course, we have the wonderful strawberry on the other side. So the evergreen was out of Oakton, Virginia, and then Jonesville, Virginia for the strawberries. And although these are not in color, historically, until just last year, actually, people would submit specialized color drawings to the US Patent Office because colors mattered so much to plant patents. You can think about like specific varieties of apples, how some of them have a specific characteristic look and things like that, like ones that are designed to be very red or very green. So colors were important. And there are places that you can look up plant patents as in the color images. One of another school that has a patent and trademark research center, University of Maryland, up towards just on the other side of Nova, on the other side of DC, they spent years scanning plant patents so that you can look them up online. US Patent and Trademark Office now today just stopped issuing physical plant patents last year. So it was just considered to be time that the colors could catch up. And you can think about maybe even a decade ago, you could have something that someone put on their computer and then you put it on yours and the color doesn't look the same. And so they were working on navigating that. I also found plenty of peach and apple trees. I even found a peach tree, although they didn't have an image, from Blacksburg, Virginia. I was surprised because we're not always warm enough for what I think about with peaches, but you can grow them a lot of places. The fun part of this is also that it's not hard to find plant patents once you know what you're doing in the main search for patents from the US Patent and Trademark Office, because you can say, give me, they're designated with a P followed by another P before the number part of the patent. And so you can just say, give me everything that starts with PP, and then I can say, and Virginia, and that gives me a lot of ones that are probably Virginia. As we get to later patents, you can start saying, okay, give me those where the inventor is in Virginia, things like that. But before the 1970s, it's all just physical text that is scanned and that optical character recognition kind of thing too. So searching for Virginia works really well. And at the end, after I'm going through this part of it, I'm not planning to lecture the whole time and just answer questions at the end. I will pop into our USPTO's database and we can run a search or two just so you can see what it looks like so you can find these inventions yourself. Okay, so continuing on with the 20th century, I had mentioned at the end of the 1800s how you could tell by the drawings how much more complex the mechanical things were getting. And these are from the 1920s through 1930. So you can think about this is continuing that strain. What I found in looking is a lot of automobile and related technologies. So even though you might think about like Ford up towards like Ohio and Michigan and things like that, Virginia was still doing plenty in these large manufacturing industries. So this first one on the left-hand side is actually an automobile door latch. So that's what the specific part here is. It's showing how the door would be latched. And then you have a side cutting looking at the door. So back in this was 1925, filed in 1923. And so there's all these different mechanisms. And this person was out of Bridgewater, Virginia. The next one is a liquid level indicator. So you might have seen this kind of thing in a car or other places. And this is for saying, okay, how much liquid is in something? And this was also, this was out of Staunton. And then the last one is actually talking about bearings that involve thrust So when I say thrust, I'm talking about like the force that moves vehicles and things like that. Or you can think about like the classic these days is talking about rocket thrust. So the force from the rocket engine that's pushing it up into the sky. And so these were the bearings, like the parts that help it move and things like that. And this was a Richmond invention. So there's all these, they're starting to really get towards some things that we might still see around today and that people would start to recognize. Other fun things I found in the 1940s, there was a attachment for rip saws. So you can start to think about how people are working with these large machineries and saws, and we still have things that go onto like woodworking tables and things like that today. So you can see that there's a circular part, and then we have different parts of it and how it attaches there. Next to it on the right-hand side is a design patent that's also around. And this one is a classic Arlington patent. And what they did was they took like that view of the Capitol at the time and they said, okay, I'm going to design this thing that's going to be for license plate holders. So we still have license plates today that are like you'll see in the case of Virginia, we have Virginia for lovers, but people have something around it a lot of times that advertises where I'm at. It might be that they're a Hokie. Other places, it might be their auto repair technician, all sorts of things. So this was a design patent though from 1940. People were already creating decorations for people's license plates back then. So like I said, very focused on automobiles, and people are starting to move around and get involved more with manufacturing and things like that. Okay, so now we're getting into more modern ones. And one of the other things that you'll notice when looking into inventions in the 20th century is that there was a lot of inventions with multiple states involved. These large corporations are starting to develop. There were some with Virginia headquarters, but the actual inventions might be out of state. One of the ones that I found a lot when looking through the patents was Stewart Warner Corporation of Virginia, but they're housed out of Illinois. So there was some strange things like that. One of the great resources that I want to point folks to is the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. They list out a bunch of Virginia companies. And this is what I already hinted at. There was the Central Coca-Cola Bottling Company, and that was in Richmond through most of the 20th century. There was also a clothing company, a general products company. James River did paper, things like that. There was Lane cedar chests. This is something that you might have in your attics, or basements. You might still have some around. And then Universal Leaf Tobacco Company, still in existence today. And then there was also a research laboratory that did things with paper and books as well. So there were all these companies starting to invest in Virginia and develop things that Virginians wanted, other people in the country wanted. In the case of Coca-Cola bottles, that actually expanded from just being in Richmond to multiple counties in Virginia for bottling Coca-Cola. Let's talk about the cedar chests. This was something that I found that was really fun from the VA Museum of History and Culture. They talk about when you're getting married, if you make sure you get your fiance a Lane cedar chest, it shows that you're ready to invest in your life together. And so you'll want to go to Lane Furniture and get everything you need. Next to it is the actual patent, and this was by Lofton of Alta Vista. And this is where you start to see more than just, although this was 1932, this is what I'm talking about with companies. Each patent, and I'll explain a little bit more on this at the end, but you have the inventor, but then you have something called an assignee. This is the person who owns the patent, quote unquote, and handles all the litigation and things like that related to it. So in this case, although Lofton was the inventor, the patent was owned by the company that was making these. And that's what we see today very commonly. But I still thought that was a nice case of like woodworking and industry, and it's also talking about bringing a family together with this invention. And this was only a cedar chest, but it was so specific that it ended up being not a design patent, but the usual, like, how it works, how it functions kind of patent, because it mattered what it was made out of. It mattered how it locked, how the lid was, all these different things were all part of it. Down in at the bottom, you'll even see they showed a portion of the corner saying, okay, here's specifically how it was designed. But these companies, some of them even continued into times when I've been alive and a lot of us have been alive. Although 1972, I wasn't quite alive yet, but this was one of the ones out of the Barrow Research Lab. They actually developed something that would help with de-acidifying paper. So you can think about like keeping books in good condition for years and years. And it was actually assigned to DC because of Washington, DC, where there was the Council for Library Services and things like that. So the patent, it was owned by this group up in DC, but it still came out of Virginia. The next one, I hope some of you might be able to guess what this is just from seeing part of it. And the hint I will say is parties. I'll give a minute for folks to think to see if you can figure out what this middle patent is.
I think I may know, Sarah.
Yes, yes. If you're thinking paper plates, you are correct.
Yes.
So I found this one by chance, but this was one of the companies that I listed there, the James River Corporation. That was one of the things they created was paper plates. And I'm like, this looks exactly like what we see all the time today at parties and other places. So that was one, they did a lot with paper products. There was even some that involved paper and microwaving it and things like that. So that was in 1994. So fairly recent as far as the history. We started in the 1700s. We made it all the way to 2008 for the next one, which is actually a very basic drawing is what it looks like, but it's actually a very complex system. This is for scanning and sorting tobacco leaves. So this is that Universal Tobacco Company that I would mention that's still in existence today. It's still in Richmond. This is still one of Virginia's industries. No matter how you might feel about tobacco and smoking, this is like a lot of other things. It is part of our history. So these were really fun ones that I found. And then of course, my background is aerospace and nuclear engineering, actually. I'm a bibliophile, so now you get to how I work in a library. So one of the things that is really fun is you can find some patents from NASA Langley Research Center. So it was originally what is called NACA, and that's National Aeronautics Commission. I forget the full acronym, but before NASA was NASA, there was NACA, and that was when they dealt with more airplanes and things like that. And Langley came out of that history, but come the 1950s and 60s, of course, everyone was doing space flight because got to beat the Soviets. But prior to around 1960, it can be hard to find NASA patents because they were assigned to the United States, represented by the Secretary of the Navy. And so they didn't say the NASA Center, so you can only tell sometimes by that designation plus location. Although the patents are assigned to the inventors' cities will be listed. In the case of Langley, that could be Newport News, it could be Hampton, it could be surrounding areas, depending on how far folks were driving to get to work. But fortunately, after 1960, you start to see National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and you see that spelled out, so these can be found. This first one on this slide is actually a runway light. So what they're showing in the cutaway is part of it is underground that holds it in place, and then you have this part that can pop up and help illuminate the runway. And of course, I needed to find some space ones. this one, although I'm not sure I've ever seen it in actuality being produced, but one of the patents that came out of NASA Langley in the early 60s was a self-supporting space vehicle. So they were trying to figure out how to fit something in the top of a capsule. That's what's in the lower left image, and then have it maybe expand out. And we're still talking about expandable structures for spaceflight today. And that's something that's becoming more and more feasible. And then the next ones I have from Langley, we have a classic airplane type design, but the neat part is that they're displaying when wings can pop out, because the angle of the wings matters for its performance. If you picture some really fast jets that you might see, or like bombers, you can think about how the wings are really swept back, is what it's called. But sometimes you might want the more perpendicular wings, like you see on regular passenger planes, for stability. And so this was an invention where they talked about the wings could go back and forth. And then the one in the middle is talking about a re-entry vehicle for space and getting through the atmosphere. So they even included a little fun drawing of a rocket launching, the parts separating and coming back. And you'll still see these kinds of drawings today from NASA to illustrate mission planning. And then the last one, although I don't think this was actually the Mercury capsule, this is very similar. This is exactly how they designed it. This is a space capsule. They have the astronauts laying on their back for because you need that for launch. And it makes sense for re-entry if you're going that bottom of the cone in, because you want to have the G-forces through the center of your chest is how it works. You can think about roller coasters and things like that, how sometimes in cars, people get motion sick when going side to side, but not just accelerating and decelerating. It's like that. How I found these was searching in USPTO's search. I did like National Aeronautics in quotes, and this is to keep the words together. And then I said, and Space Administration, and then I said, and Hampton or Newport News. So there's a lot of neat ways. The last part I'm going to cover before we talk about resources to find things yourself is I also wanted to cover some diversity inventions in, as far as everything I've covered, a lot of them were white men. And there's a lot more to inventions than just white men. And so I also looked into some Black and women inventions. And so I'm going to cover some of the Black ones first. And as you might expect, the earliest ones were more focused on household goods. So you can think about they were developing their households and not necessarily working the same jobs. And a lot of times the jobs were very hard and demanding. I did find patents before 1990, and it was less than 20 years post the Civil War. So this was really great. And a shout out to Margaret Collins of Illinois, if they're still working as a PTRC representative. Other people in a position like mine in the past have compiled lists of patents, and this was one of them that I consulted. So later in the 20th century and beyond, there was patents that covered all fields from sports through medicine, and it was really great to see these. Some even had multiple inventors. So some had some inventors had multiple patents. There we go. So Emmanuel Logan did a lot with lighting, including a classic exit sign that you'll probably recognize once you see it. There was George Alcon, who did a lot with X-ray spectrometers. Donald Lyons, who did optical networks and even artificial nerves. So these are all some, like, we went from just basic household ones to here's some really modern, highly that require like lots of like PhD level knowledge to design. So the earliest ones that I could find, 1880, I found a file holder, and that's what this first one is on the left-hand side. And you can see there's even that little classic latch there for the files. Next, I found this was a more complex one just in 1901, and this was for stemming and cleaning peanuts or green peas. So you can think about the things that a lot of times Black men and women probably were having to do manually, and someone said, okay, let's make this easier for everyone. and let's get through this difficult work. And the last one is a folding chair. And this is one from um, and Alexander, and you'll actually be able to find more on this patent because there are some places on the internet that talk about this one and how he wanted it to be for like church gatherings or other things to help because you suddenly have a lot of people, but you don't need those chairs around all the time. And in order of left to right, these were out of Alexandria, Vicksville, and Lynchburg. So somewhat all over the state too. And then the later ones are, here's that classic exit sign. The one in the middle is a basketball rim and net. So not what we have today, but also was there. And then this last one that you may not be sure exactly what this is artificial nerves. And these were all from like the 1970s and beyond. So the exit sign was really caught me because I'm like, that looks exactly like what we still use today. Okay, and to finish things off, here are some bit on women inventors too. So there's a partial list I could find that was compiled under the direction of Commissioner of Patents, and I call it a partial list because some parts from like the Library of Congress, one of the books I got off of their list said that it's missing some things, and that's entirely possible because it was a list compiled by a man. But what really struck me is some of the early patents even touched on medicine, but there was still what you expect, like clothing and household goods. Be sure to check out Virginia's Women in History site. These are more modern inventors. Bessie Griffin worked a lot with amputees and things like that post the World Wars and had an invention for that. And Jocelyn Harrison is a chemical engineer who's still alive and has over 23 patents granted jointly with other researchers from being at Langley. So here's those modern ones first. B. Griffin had something that would attach onto someone that you would have like their food or something held. So you can picture an amputee might not be able to carry things. So she was really thinking about how to help people. And then this next one is by Jay Harrison, well at Langley Research Center. And this is related to electrodes and nano, lots of other cool stuff. And then last, the older ones that were pre-1990, we even had someone already looking after things like uterine prolapse was the first one I found. And then there was also on the right-hand side is a grill out of Leesburg, Virginia, Mary Avard. And the ones in the middle didn't have any drawings because they were medicines or formulations. So someone had a salve that was meant for or plaster for the cure of cancers, and they're talking about like skin lesions in this context because this was the 1800s before we're talking about cancer like we do today. And then there was also one to cure cholera that worked on. So this is what really struck me, that all these women in history are working on medicine, and this doesn't come out because you don't see many women doctors back then. Okay, so finally, where do you find stuff? And you can look in big patent databases, including Patent Public Search, which I'll pop into probably during the Q&A. There's also lens.org, which is a great one, and Google Patents, which can be hard to navigate if you don't know much, but it's also really good at reading off different parts of the text. If you visit us at Virginia Tech or other places, there's lots of options available because we have a few other things that we're subscribed to. This is just for your reference, and these slides will be on a guide that I will give you a link to as well at the end. I mentioned Burke's list. There's also Leggett's list, and then there's also librarian research lists that I mentioned. The other place you can check is the official Gazette, and this is where since the mid 1800s, towards later 1800s, they started saying, okay, on a weekly basis, here's all the ones that were granted. And so if you know around the time that your ancestor or someone that you know might have had a patent, that's another place that you can look. It's still published today. And you can, of course, check universities, libraries, museums, and more. In Virginia, we have a Museum of History and Culture I mentioned earlier. There's also the National Inventors Hall of Fame and Museum, Library of Congress. And I mentioned a couple things from universities here. We highlighted our 2023 inventors. UVA had a great article on discoveries of the last 50 years. I even found a quarterly historical magazine from William and Mary, and they list out Virginia inventions. I even found things from local libraries, like on Fredericksburg's industry. So just keep in mind, there's a lot of places you can find this information. And last, I have here some ones that I did some quick searches and was able to find. Like these are all from early patents from Blacksburg, Virginia. Unfortunately, Blacksburg and Virginia are unique enough when put together that most of the ones I found were actually Blacksburg, Virginia. Um, the other way you can do it is by a name. I'm fortunate to have some patent holders in my family, and I still knew them in my lifetime, so it wasn't a matter of family lore, it was just a matter of finding them. And so I found my grandfather's and my uncle's patent. And this is where you can run a quick search sometimes if you have a unique enough name. Although I will say my last name that's from my dad's side of Over, it doesn't work when I search it because it's not a word that's easily found. And last, I'll point out a couple of things to note is that this is what I was talking about, where you have the title of the patent, but you also have the inventor and the owner are separate things. So if you're looking for a specific location, be sure to check both of those because a company might be the owner and then the inventor might be even in another state. And then they'll also list when they were filed. And generally there is a 2-year gap or so. The 1940s, you might see more than that because of the war. And there's even things like classifications and whatnot. If you really get into patents, you can reach out and I'll help you figure out what those classifications are. And of course, I had to throw in a couple of thread and sewing and fabric related patents because I already included a few, but this one on the right side is actually camouflage. And that was actually out of Arlington, Virginia. Of course, if it was in color, it'd be more obvious, but there's even a carding engine and then a tensioning device for sewing machines. So for resources I have for you, this is we have a patent and trademark guide. This is our library resources page. I do have a Virginia history page up now with a lot of the same information. And we will be putting the link available, but it's just guides.lib.vt.edu/ptrc, and you'll be able to get to all the information that you might want. And on my ending slide, I did find a recent patent application that included AI from Capital One in McLean, Virginia. So invention continues. And we can pop over into questions right now, and I will stop my share for now. And I'm sure we have some in the Q&A and other places. How are we doing, Alicia?
We're doing great. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was fascinating. So if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A. But we did have some questions that were submitted ahead of time.
Sure.
And I think you already kind of answered this one, but do you currently or have historically have inventors have to submit physical models of their inventions, or has it always just been drawings?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Yes, physical models were required for a while, and that's part of what was lost in actually the fire because there was all these physical models around. Maybe that's part of why it burned more effectively, because a lot of them were probably made out of wood. But yes, models were originally required. That got thrown out as the years passed because, well, space and people are all over the country and it just delays patents being granted.
Yeah, it's remarkable how much fire affects your ability to do historical research. The 1890 census is missing almost completely. Only like 10 or 15% of it exists because it was destroyed by a fire. I also know from my master's research, a lot of the early lighthouse records in the country were destroyed by one of the fires at the Library of Congress.
Mhm.
So sometimes there's just not much you can do.
Yes, and I see we do have in the Q&A. So we have a question on how can you tell the race or ethnicity of the patent holder? Great question. I wouldn't be able to answer that if I hadn't found a fellow librarian that had already done research, because you have to go by the name and see what you can find in their history to try to confirm that. And so these days, you could probably look up pictures of someone, but from the 1800s or probably even the early 1900s, we're not talking about color. And so people would go based on where they're living, because we did have segregated communities. You can look up those kinds of things. So you might be able to make a guess based on the names, but this was something that people went through and said, okay, this is important. We need to figure this out. So the lists that I present are probably incomplete. I only found 70 or so patents from like African Americans, Black people in Virginia from like up to year 2000, which seems way too low to me. So I know that there's got to be ones that are missing there. And it would take hours upon years of work to probably figure out all of these across the country. But great question.
Yeah, because you would almost have to like compare them to census records,
Mhm.
which
Yeah.
census records are also difficult sometimes.
Yes. And if the patent fell in the middle, like in the middle of that 10-year period, you wouldn't necessarily know if the person was still in the same,
Mhm.
you actually are looking at the same person.
Yeah. Or if you have one of those families where they just name everyone the same names.
Yes. Yes. I am sorry for all of you that are named Smith and you want to look up patents in your history.
It's okay. Another question was, are intellectual or non-physical inventions patented, or does that fall under something else?
Yes. So originally those were patented and they later became design patents and then they became trademarks. So they are protected. Um, Earlier in the talk, I was showing that screw head that looked like a sunflower, and we had that peaches poster, like food
Mhm.
label kind of thing. So that's how those kinds of things were protected, because they decided that, yes, how something looks does matter to the object.
Okay. And have there ever been patents on like things that are just intellectual, what we would
Yes.
consider intellectual property at this point?
Yeah. There are patents that are just the processes for
Okay.
things instead of a physical object. Probably a famous one, or you could say infamous, is Amazon. Even back before like the year 2000, they were already working on one-click purchasing for their website. And so that would be a process. They were working through each step that they would need to have their system do and what the consumer would do.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
That's fascinating. Also, it makes me feel better that like it took Amazon that long to get it figured out. Um, if they can't do it any faster, it's fine that we're not. Um, One of the things I noticed on all of the pictures is, and you mentioned this a little bit, but there's always witnesses. Were they witnesses for the inventors when they were submitting their patent applications, or were they from the patent office? Do you know?
I think based on the names from looking at that, and again, I think because I'd have to look up to be sure, but they were people that witnessed the patent application before it went to the patent office.
Okay.
So basically like we consider getting something notarized today.
Yeah. Or
Um,
when you get married and you have to have witnesses.
yes. Yeah, and I guess if we have a couple minutes, one thing I can do is anyone who's listening, if you have a city in Virginia or something like that you'd like me to try to find patents for, I can demo live a little bit.
Yeah, that would be great.
So I'll go ahead and share my screen again. And we did also have a question about that came in ahead of time on patents by state and where Virginia falls. And you can find this with a Google search on USPTO, although it's only through 2015. And I'm sorry to say that Virginia is well behind a lot of states. And of course, California and New York are leading the pack. So, but yeah, so I'm going to go into something called Patent Public Search. And the landing page for this from the US Patent and Trademark Office looks like this. One thing that you might do if you know the name of something you're looking for, you might go into the quick lookup. Like you can go by number here, which is really convenient for when I found these lists of patents, because I could just pop in the number and get the PDF of the patent. And then if I were to search here, this will only get more recent patents. So a lot of times for historical ones, you want to go into the advanced search. And do we have anything in the Q&A, any city ideas? Otherwise, I'll.
We'll let you go ahead and make it up.
Well, I already did Blacksburg. Let's do Christiansburg. It always works better to do somewhere that you know something about. So I'll say Christiansburg and Virginia. And what I'm doing is I'm putting quotes around the words, even though it shouldn't matter to say, only give me this exact word. And then I'm saying putting and between them, because this is like if you're typing into a Google search, it automatically assumes that you want both terms. If I had said or, I would get towns of Christiansburg that might not be in Virginia. So I want to say and. And then if we want to find ones that are before, let's say if we want to find ones that are really old, let's say before 1900, we could also say and I'll say at PY for pub year. And then I can say less than 1900. And this is syntax that you learn over time, but they also have a help menu here that you can scroll through. And this is where it talks about ands and all sorts of things you can search for, including this year part. So I can go down in here and say, here's the date ranges. So if you're interested in a specific date range, it tells you exactly what to do. There are lots of options for searching with USPTO. Okay, I pressed search. We did get 3 results. And you can see this looks a little funny because scanning and recognizing text doesn't always work for really old stuff. So a lot of times you'll want to click on the document viewer. And this was a clothespin. That's appropriate for this talk.
That's amazing.
And this is actually a circular one. They must have designed it so you could have one clip and have multiple bits of clothes come in.
Yeah.
And a lot of times sometimes this is an older one. Let's see, what year is this? 1896. So, and then you can go through the page of the patent here, and then I can go through the different inventions here. Okay, a nut lock, that makes sense. You want to hold something in place. And then let's see what the last one is. Foot power hammer. So you can see the hammer here is coming down so someone can press on it. You can think about, again, back to sewing machines, you have foot powered.
Yeah.
So the same kind of idea, but it's for a hammer. So this is how you might think about starting to look for ones from a specific region. The other thing I'll add though with really old ones is I might want to, instead of saying Christiansburg, I might want to say Montgomery for Montgomery County. Because people might specify their county in the text that this is reading off of instead of the city.
Yeah. And there's also places change names. So I discovered this with one of my board members. She was working on another project for me, and she said, I cannot find this county that you have mentioned. And I was like, let me do some research. And I looked, and it was a county that doesn't exist anymore. It was the county was absorbed into the city of Virginia Beach. And so now it's all just the city of Virginia Beach. And I was like, oh, that's because since 1963, that county hasn't existed.
Yes, and this one does say Christiansburg, but if I look down here in the text, Christiansburg is broken up because the text is split between 2 lines. But it's still, a lot of these early patents will say in the county of, even if they say the city. And I got 44 results instead of just 3. And I can sort by date. So this might be one of the earliest ones. So 1838. Yeah, and it's Christiansburg. So Christiansburg is the county seat from Montgomery. So that's why I knew searching Montgomery would probably get me those. So utilizing knowledge of those. And so we'll finish off. Let me pull up our PTRC guide so everyone watching can find this again. And I do have there's lots of parts here on patents. You want to go over here to the VA inventions history. And I even grabbed a map from the Library of Congress that shows when the two states were won. And you can click through all the pages. I even have some lists here. I just highlighted a few from there. There's also these historical lists are, the full ones are also here if you want to consult the ones that I haven't edited at all, to just find Virginia. So I have it going through all the patents. You can go through, and there's also the research resources where I talk about how to run some of these searches. And if you're getting stuck or have questions, you can go back to the homepage, scroll down a little bit, and you'll see my picture. You can email me. You can even schedule an appointment with me. I have Zoom appointments, so anyone all over the state, you don't need to come physically to Blacksburg.
That is great.
So I hope everyone has enjoyed this talk on Virginia inventions, and you're motivated to find more ideas for your quilts and learn about your family history, maybe.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you to everyone for joining us. I hope you have a good evening, and I'm going to stop recording